The United States is a nation divided. When elections come round, there are Democrats on one side, Republicans on the other, and a lot of people who haven't made up their minds. And those groups mostly don't talk to each other a whole lot about politics. You don't want to get into a conversation that turns awkward after all. But there is one group that has shown remarkable unity in American politics: African Americans. Fully 87% of African American men who voted cast their ballots for Joe Biden. 95% of African American women who voted for Biden as well. That's astounding. But it's also unsteady. It's shifting, and it could be a big problem for President Biden, and it could be a small but significant boost for Donald Trump. Tammy Greer joins us now to talk about this. She's watching how the community is responding to these two leaders. Let me ask you, first of all, about this remarkable allegiance in the African American community to the Democratic Party and to Joe Biden in particular. Why is it?
So the allegiance has to do mostly with the way that the Democratic Party, the current iteration of the Democratic Party, how they communicate to the African American community, and I would say go so far as to say non-white community in the United States as it pertains to policy in particular. The way the conversation goes from the Republican side of the political ideology is more geared toward a demonization, that one could argue, as it pertains to different groups within the United States. And that demonization tends to turn off non-white voters, even if some of their policies are have some compromise to them, have some benefit to those particular communities. The way to which some of the individuals talk about the different groups within the United States and around the world is the reason why you have such a large allegiance of non-white communities to the Democratic Party.
And how helpful is that to the Democratic Party? How helpful was it to Joe Biden?
It's very helpful. One could argue that with some of the policies that the former president, Donald Trump, provided, there was benefit to certain communities, certain non-white communities in the United States. And yet, and still, with the way that the former president talked about the community, demonized, minimalized, or even talked down to non-white communities, that superseded any policies that were actually beneficial. So for Joe Biden, there's an understanding of how to talk to different communities, how to express the importance of policy, how to express the importance of impact of policy. And that helped to galvanize African Americans and other non-white communities to support Joe Biden.
Well, I got to ask you, I mean, what kind of language, what was it about Trump that alienated non-white communities?
It was the dismissiveness of and the othering of non-whites. So if we consider what is a real American, right, quote unquote, real American, that is dog whistle. I know we hear that term a lot, but it's dog whistle as if you are non-white, you are not a quote unquote true American. And so to say those things to different groups in front of different groups, being adjacent or friendly to supremacist groups, then you're just opening the door for someone to turn off your policy because you have heightened your rhetoric.
Now, I've got to share a piece of terminology that's going to be key here. A dog whistle. Now, a dog whistle obviously is a whistle that dogs can hear that humans cannot. In the American political context, a dog whistle is a signal that most people will ignore or not notice, but that a particular community might. So a dog whistle to a racist group is to use racist language that sounds polite to other people, but demonstrates a certain kind of allegiance to what racists are thinking. Is that a fair description of what you've been seeing?
Very fair. Very fair. Yes. Thank you. So an example of a dog whistle is to say that is to call immigrants a derogatory name, or to say a true American or real American, or to use terminology, for example, saying that Black people are articulate. It sounds polite. It sounds as if you're providing a compliment, when in reality, what it is, it's a way to backhand it, to demonize one group or to lessening their contribution and to elevate another. Which in terms, when we talk about division and polarization in the United States, part of these dog whistles allow for these politicians, these wannabe candidates, to create division. When we consider some of the policies, we are closer together on some of the policies than we are apart. It is the dog whistle, it is the rhetoric that creates division in the United States.
All that having been said, a recent New York Times Siena poll, which seemed serious in some swing states, found that 20% of African American male voters were planning to switch their votes to Donald Trump. What do you make of that?
It makes sense. What Donald Trump has done, and even with some current version of the Conservative Party, is to elevate men in a sense of the pushing down of women in order to heighten men. And this is not just in the African American community, this is in the Latino community, this is across the board. So what tends to happen is, because there has been in recent time a resurgence or this opening to allow for women to take place inside of the work area, right? So if we're able to get in front of the camera, if we're able to take leadership positions, the way that this current group views the elevation of women is that it is replacing men. This is also the replacement theory that some conservatives come up with in terms of non-white immigrants or non-white groups, period, coming into the United States, is quote unquote replacing the white population in the United States, which allows for the demonization and the dog whistle. So in terms of Black men, because there has been in recent time an elevation or push of Black women who have been head of household in most of their homes for the past 40 or 50 years, there has been this push. And so the way that Donald Trump discusses manhood feeds into what appears to be missing out of the conversation that Black men tend to have. When it comes to who are we talking to. Usually we talk to the women, we talk to the mom, we don't talk to the dad. And so there's a feeling of not having a place inside of society that Donald Trump has elevated. He has also elevated some of the with his rhetoric, how Black men then feel about being providers, having money, being rich, having, quote unquote, beautiful women on their arm, having people to do whatever it is that they want done. This type of bravado is attractive to not just men, to women as well, which is why you see a large portion of some communities, some women in other communities vote for Donald Trump. This bravado is attractive. And because of that, you tend to have Donald Trump to be looked at as an aspirational figure, as a leader, versus someone who can actually have policy to elevate communities.
Now, we've talked for the most part about African American men. You alluded to women being attracted to Donald Trump. Are African American women shifting their positions as well? Because obviously there are more issues at stake here, and women are closer to some issues than men are.
For the most part, African American women are very clear, very pragmatic and logical in their thought process about who is the appropriate elected official for the needs of not only their community, also the community at large. So when we consider African American women, since African American women have had the ability to vote since 1965, the Voting Rights Act, you see that African American women are the most consistent voter of any demographic inside of the United States. That means from a proportional standpoint, Black women vote at a higher rate than any other group in the United States and consistently votes for Democrats for the reason because they are pragmatic. They are, again, as I said, usually head of household. So they understand not only the economics of policy, they also understand the quote unquote kitchen table issues. So they're there to talk about economics, public safety, education, healthcare, all of these components they understand because they've had to carry the load inside of their community for such a long time. So when they are consistently voting for the Democratic Party, they're doing so because of the way that the policies that Democrats tend to espouse, those policies tends to encompass all of those metrics that are important to the African American community, and thus has a ripple effect throughout all the communities within the United States.
So let's look at the impact in this year's election. African American women are going to stick with the Biden ticket. African American men are largely going to stick with Biden, but some are deserting him. Maybe a few thousand in a few states. In swing states, maybe more than a few thousand. In places like Georgia and Michigan, swing states that Biden barely won, how important are those few thousand votes? When you look at this nationwide, how important could this small drift away from the Democratic Party influence the outcome of the election?
It's a huge concern. In Georgia, it was 11,780 votes that gave the victory to Joe Biden, which is tremendous when we consider the 4 years in 2016. So the shift to Joe Biden for Georgia, major win for the Biden administration. At the same time, it's still a very fragile win. So in terms of how to get to those particular voters, there has to be a concerted effort. And of course, the thought process here is that whatever the former president is promising or whatever his rhetoric is, it seems very attractive. Again, from a long-term perspective, though, it's very damaging to not only the African American community, other communities across the United States. So when we consider, for example, in the Biden administration, you see individuals from all walks of life who are represented in the administration. Not only is that important from an outward-facing representative democracy kind of image, it is also helpful because their perspective may be different from those that are traditionally inside of presidential administrations. And then they are allowed to impact policy from a long-term perspective. The other part is, and what we really don't talk about from a nuanced perspective, is that the president has the ability to appoint federal judges. And federal judges are on the bench for their entire lifetime if they so choose, or unless they are impeached. And so if you have someone who is able to look at the Constitution and to rule on cases based on their perspective and understanding of the Constitution, who can be on the bench for 30, 40, or 50 years, that has a deep impact on policy. So it's not just the Supreme Court, it's also the lower federal courts. And if we had a great appreciation for the power of the presidency beyond the talking points, when it comes to true impact, then perhaps we would make more informed decisions.
I just want to ask you one last question. I guess this is the most important one. There are a lot of people who say that African American voters who turned out for Barack Obama didn't turn out in quite the same numbers for Hillary Clinton, which is why Donald Trump got to be president. Joe Biden would have this echoing in his head, I would imagine. If African American voters don't turn out for him in the same way they didn't turn out for Hillary Clinton, is Trump going to win as a result? Are African Americans ultimately potentially going to decide this race?
Yes, because there are margins. At the same time, while I can appreciate the question, African Americans, Latinos, Asians, Native Americans, we are very new to the civic process in the United States. And when we look at it from a population standpoint, the population of all non-whites is still less than whites in the United States. So while I can appreciate, especially on the margins, that it matters, right? Pennies turn into nickels, into dimes, into quarters, into dollars. I really appreciate that. The pressure, though, on these new groups who are new to full citizenship in the country sometimes seems unfair when you still have a majority population who have had the ability to vote for centuries. They have some ownership in the trajectory of the country as well.
I get your point. Tammy Greer, thanks very much.